just saw Sound of Metal last night as of recording, and I just feel like something needs to be said about this film. I absolutely loved it, and it easily makes a spot in my top 10 for the year, and may even be a contender for spot number 1. It's a patiently told story about an angry musician who begins to lose his hearing, and if there's one word I'd use to describe it, it would be moving. Sound of Metal is profoundly moving, and I feel like I got a lot out of it. If you liked movies like Patterson and Inside Llewyn Davis like I did, this is like the third unofficial sequel. It really fits in and has the same vibe as those films, so if you haven't seen it, there's your recommendation. But the rest of this video will be for those who have seen it, which I'm aware may be the minority, but that's alright. I want to talk about the story as a whole from here on out, so spoilers, buddies. Sound of Metal is about growing up. Despite the fact that our protagonist here in Ruben is already a grown man by the start, he's in a stage of his life before a big change, though unaware of it at the time. The film starts off with Ruben living in an RV with his girlfriend Lou, and even at this point I kind of have to respect this way of life. See, they are completely minimalists. Having been 4 years sober, most likely thanks to Lou, Ruben seems to have created this lifestyle that's solely based on his passion for music and for Lou herself. From their point of view, all they need is each other and just enough to get by, with just enough space, maybe a little less than just enough money, and with their bond that gets them from gig to gig where they perform experimental metal. In this way of life, Ruben was able to keep fit and happy enough, but I do think that the anger was still there. Maybe not when things went right, but when things did go wrong, I do think that there was this lingering sense there that he was kind of on the edge. By the end of the film, we and Ruben begin to realize that maybe he was also codependent in this relationship that he's in with Lou as well. And this brewing anger obviously only escalates when he begins to lose his hearing. The scenes that had him playing further into damaging his hearing was also really frustrating to see. Clearly there was an issue, but he kept going even when he knew it was probably only going to make everything worse. But I can sympathize with it. Though stupid, this is for him at the time what he loves. The music, the performance, it's all such a big part of his life. And without it, he is aimless. And without it, he and Lou might not even have a place together, which may have a returning theme later on, but we'll get to that. The beginning of him gaining desperation into trying to find help and trying to find a solution was so damn captivating in a series of scenes that otherwise could have come off as extremely melodramatic, but nah, Sound of Metal is never that. This film balances its sense of reality and cinematic intricacy with this great performance by Riz Ahmed, who is so damn good. The frustration and fear and total hopelessness really came through and resonated with me. He even became kind of a dick in some ways too. Dealing with such a big issue, he becomes apathetic and even a little self-centered. But then again, in this situation, how could you not be? Anyway, I can't stress just how good this guy is with the material that he has. He's such a good actor. I hope he begins to get recognized more. I've only seen a few movies with him, but one of them is literally my favorite film of all time in Nightcrawler, but I do always think that he's good in whatever he's in, even fucking Venom, I guess. In saying that though, let's really get to the meat of the subject here. I feel like I myself would really struggle in this situation further down the line once it gets to the deaf community. Having to be surrounded by the positivity and people trying to teach me sign language and having to participate in what seems like total bullshit when all I want to do is get my hearing back would be such a sudden punch to the gut. It'd be just a brick wall, and it is one that Ruben can't just get over without having to put some effort in. But see, putting the effort in would require once, even for a second, accepting the fact that maybe his hearing won't improve, and he's not having any of that for the time being, and I really understand that. Beginning to learn to be okay with this is kind of the same as giving up and committing to the deafness at this point in his eyes. But of course, the film becomes so much more about learning that deafness isn't always something to look down upon as a disability. In fact, it was really interesting seeing some of the nameless characters connect and talk to each other in very natural ways despite no speech coming through. Like, there were scenes where they'd sit at a dinner table and sign quicker than I could maybe even talk. Like, I don't know for sure because, you know, it's hard to tell because I don't actually know sign language. but it seemed like there was just natural laughter going on and real conversation, and it was just interesting to see. Also, like a knock on the door turns into a flickering light switch, since all they have is the visual cue rather than the audio one. This is less so about Ruben's journey at this point and just me talking about these little interesting things I noticed in how deaf people get by, but I kind of really admire anyone who has been in a situation like the main character here, in which they've already grown up having had hearing and then having to learn to go without it. Like, what a challenge. I can't imagine. The deaf community school showed Ruben throughout that not only were there other people experiencing what he was, but also that there were other ways to live and work your way through it. Though I do find it a bit silly to act superior when the, whatever is called, the boss guy there was like, nah, don't fix your hearing if you can. We don't like that here. We don't see deafness as a disability, so that means you're not allowed to improve your hearing because, well, fuck you, that's why. Basically what the guy was saying. And look, I see where he's coming from, but I kind of disagree. Then again, I'm not deaf and I don't know what it's like, so, you know, and also I can kind of understand the mindset for the children in the deaf community in how important it would be to keep up the morale. So maybe he really actually did raise a good point. If they begin to view themselves as inferior because of this disability, that could be a real damaging thing. So I guess there's different ways to look at it from. Anyway, I'd be so scared to live in a world without sound myself. Watching Ruben struggle with this idea was impactful, and watching him learn to accept it was more moving than I'd ever have expected. The lack of accessibility in communication and the disability to be able to do what he loved most was painful to see. But by the end, there was a certain serenity in seeing Ruben be okay with it. That by the end, even when he had the option, he'd really learned to appreciate the silence, the what now seems like a bustling, self-obsessed and noisy world. What was once a place he belonged now feels a little more unnecessary. I feel like by the end, Ruben realizes that maybe his old way of life isn't for him anymore, and that he needs to forge a new path. That maybe the music industry isn't for him anymore for more reasons than just his hearing will never be perfect again. The whole culture of it. It's a part of his past. Not something to be sad about being over or to think that he's now superior then, but just a part of his past who made him who he is now. This film is very much about changing over time and finding out who you can become through changes in lifestyle and thus mindset. Because who was once an angry, roughed up and struggling with addiction man in Ruben, he is now someone who found inner peace, and even someone who found himself thanks to the silence. Sound of Metal is really about people growing out of their respective phases more so than it is about punk rock and metal albums. Lou wasn't really as punk as she thought she was. It was just a rebellious time in her life, going against the grain of her rich family. Her mum had tragically killed herself, and so she was lost for the time being, and Ruben was there. And Ruben himself was perhaps always lost to begin with. They saved each other at a time where they needed each other. But by the end, I think they realized that they weren't who they were prior to the events of the film anymore. Lou had come to accept where she'd come from and to forgive, and Ruben found peace in the place where he feared most, silence. By the end, they'd spent so much time apart and did some growing of themselves independently, and I think, well, they became distanced because of it. And their last conversation is about realizing this. They weren't quite prepared for the moment either, which followed, but it all led to this. Though they both did have the intentions on returning to one another, and just by the way, I'm so glad she didn't cheat on him because that would have been such an easy plot device to use here. Anyway, they still had love for each other. Their time as a romantic couple had just kind of run its course, but even in realizing this, there's no hatred, there's no conflict. It's okay. They may be just not wired together anymore, and from them, it's okay to look back on the time where they were, fondly. It was an important relationship in their lives, and still is. They saved each other from addiction, from hard times, etc. They needed each other at that time in their lives, but now it's a different time. It was time to move on. If Ruben had never lost his hearing though, I do think that they could have kept at it and still been happy enough. They seemed good at the start. They seemed like they were good for each other. But the time in between did change them. For better or for worse, they'd stopped rebelling against the world and found themselves. Lou now thriving and doing much better. She's getting out of her stages of mental illness and the dark place in which she'd once been. And Ruben, now somebody completely different with perhaps a better outlook and a different way of looking at life in general. He'd gotten out of his ways of addiction, which the literal sound of metal maybe dragged him further into in terms of his routines and dependency prior to the events of the film. I like to think from here on, after the movie's timeline, that he returns to that deaf community camp and he teaches if they accept him back. Their last talk maybe hinted that that wouldn't be a possibility, but in my perfect happy ending type of headcanon, that's exactly what happens. Anyway, yeah, Sound of Metal is such a powerful movie with great sound design and atmosphere. It understands the cultures of the hard rock scene and the deaf community and depicted a world that really felt lived in. Clearly, so much thought was put into this wonderfully told character-driven story. Sound of Metal is thoughtful and patient and ultimately is about accepting the things that we cannot control in life and being better for it.